Hello! My most recent video got a response from a channel called Planar Walk. I want to first say thank you to Planar. I really appreciate the time that he took to make his response. In a second, we'll go through the entirety of his video. But before that, I want to first clear up a misconception that Planar appears to have had about my original video. Planar seems to have thought that my video was just about the Kalam. This is false. My video was actually about a family of arguments called the cosmological arguments. The Kalam is indeed a cosmological argument, arguably the most famous of them, so I was using it as an illustration in the beginning of my video. But halfway through the video, I started talking about the contingency argument. These are completely different arguments. The Kalam argues that there's a cause of the universe, and he's God. The contingency argument argues there's a self-existent or necessary being, and he's God. But Planar didn't realize I had changed which argument I was talking about. He thought I was talking about the Kalam the whole time, and I was just using the term necessary being interchangeably with the cause of the universe. Here's the clip of him saying this explicitly.
Anyway, that's it for this video. I was hoping to hear some arguments as to why the cause, or necessary being, as he puts it, must have a mind or must be a god. Unfortunately, that was not presented. I get that that's not the point of the video, but it's still a bit disappointing.
So, to clear things up, Kalam is about the cause of the universe, contingency argument is about a necessary being. Coolio. With that out of the way, let's get into the rest of Planar's video.
Ahoy hoy, I'm Planar Walk, and recently I came across a video and just by the thumbnail I thought, oh, this looks like a Minute Earth video, so I clicked on it, and it turns out that it wasn't.
I'm unfamiliar with this channel, but I don't see the resemblance.
The video was by Apologetic Squid, which I found to be fairly logically flawed, so let's take a look at it.
William Lane Craig's formulation and presentation of the Kalam is by far the most popular. It involves two parts, a short syllogism, which Craig usually puts on screen in his debates and stuff, and then a conceptual analysis of the universe's cause, which he usually just explains verbally. Now, this particular presentation has led some to mistakenly take the term, the Kalam, to refer to the syllogism only, rather than Craig's entire argument.
So I think, yes, most people are aware of the basics of the Kalam cosmological argument. And that is essentially that everything that we see has a cause, so therefore the universe itself must have had a cause. That's paraphrasing it a bit, but that's the general gist. That part is fine. It's when you try and say that that cause must have been God that you run into issues. But I'm sure that Apologetic Squid will give a good justification for why that cause has to be God. Right?
To clarify, the point of my video was not actually to defend a particular stage 2 or stage 1 case for some cosmological argument, as you yourself acknowledge. Rather, it was to show that cosmological arguments count as evidence for theism as soon as the stage 1 is complete.
This seems to be responsible for objections, like Matt Dillahunty's, that the Kalam isn't an argument for God's existence, just some generic cause of the universe. This is an annoying objection because it in no way actually objects to Craig's real argument, and it makes it look like the argument has some sort of flaw which isn't there.
To be fair, I have heard people in favour of that argument state that God must exist because the universe had to have had a cause. Obviously the rebuttal mentioned does work against that particular argument, but it may not necessarily work against an argument which provides reasons for why that cause must be a god.
Well, Craig's version of the argument does provide reasons to think the cause of the universe is God. So I guess we're on the same page so far. The only thing I would add is that instead of offering an argument with the conclusion the cause must be God, you can also argue the existence of a cause of the universe raises the probability that God exists. The way I prefer to argue that God exists is by raising theism's probability step by step with multiple independent arguments, rather than with one knockdown argument. Well, except for psychophysical harmony and nomological arguments, they're knockdown arguments, but like besides those ones.
But you are going to have a very difficult time explaining why that cause must be a god.
I would also generally agree with the sentiment behind this point. I find the first stages of these arguments to be easier to defend than their second stages. This is one of the reasons why it's important to understand that a second stage isn't strictly required for the overall argument to raise theism's probability. Anyways, up until now, we've mostly just been going over introductory stuff. Now it's time for the real meat and potatoes of the video.
Now, why do I think this is a presentation problem? It's because a cosmological argument actually does act as evidence for the existence of God, even if you only present the first stage. It would be a weaker argument for God, but it would still be evidence that he exists.
Well, not really. It's like me trying to give evidence that invisible green pixies exist, and I say, well, things fall, and that's evidence for it. No, it's not. For it to actually be evidence of the thing that I'm claiming that it's evidence for, I need to take the step of showing why it's actually evidence for the thing that I'm claiming that it's evidence for.
So it seems to me that Planar misunderstood me here, because he presents this point as an objection, but I totally agree with it. Of course we can't take something random like things fall down and use this as evidence for something else random like there are invisible green pixies. As a card-carrying Bayesian, I declare, a piece of data can only count as evidence for your theory if your theory predicts the data better than alternative theories. And the existence of pixies doesn't itself predict that things would fall down rather than fly away or float in midair. So things falling isn't evidence for invisible green pixies. I likewise agree that part of an argument for theism is going to involve showing theism predicts the relevant data. I actually mentioned this in my original video. It's what this graphic at the top of the screen is saying.
Otherwise, you could claim that literally anything is just evidence of whatever you say it's evidence for. For example, I could say that we both live in a time where I exist. Therefore, that's evidence that I am God. You see how that's a non sequitur?
Funnily enough, I disagree. First, what is evidence? I think the best definition of evidence is this. If a fact raises the probability of your theory, then this fact is evidence of your theory. This fact might only raise the probability of your theory by a tiny, minuscule amount, but it's still evidence. It would just be a tiny, minuscule amount of evidence. Now, does the mere existence of someone raise the probability that they're a god, even if by a minuscule amount? Well, yes, technically. Take Jesus, for example. Some people, aptly named Jesus mythicists, think that Jesus never existed. Say a particular Jesus mythicist was 99% sure in their position. They assigned a probability of 1 in 100 to the proposition that Jesus existed. Furthermore, they think the probability that Jesus both existed and is God is even lower. Let's say a probability of 1 in a million. Well, given these numbers, if they then study history and become convinced that Jesus did in fact exist, the probability that Jesus existed and is God jumps up to 1 in 10,000. That's still pretty low, but it's an increase. And so the existence of Jesus is technically evidence that he's God. Now, none of this is me trying to nitpick what Planar is saying. If I wanted to nitpick, I'd point out that if a pixie is invisible, then by definition, it's not green. No, rather, I'm just using this example in order to illustrate the conception of evidence that I'm using.
If you do not make an argument for how the universe having a cause is evidence of God, then that's just simply a non sequitur.
Yes, of course, if I want to argue for theism based on some feature of reality, I need to argue that this feature of reality is evidence for theism. But how does one do that? Well, if theism is better than other theories at predicting the specific feature of reality that we're talking about, that feature is evidence for theism. No ifs, ands, or buts. Put more formally, I need to show that the probability of some proposition given theism is higher than the probability of this proposition given the negation of theism. If I can do this, then the truth of this proposition is guaranteed to increase the probability of theism. Now, this is actually one instance where Planar's confusion between the Kalam and the contingency argument comes into play. With the contingency argument, showing that theism better predicts a necessary being than the negation of theism is really easy because the existence of a necessary being is baked into theism, so to speak. There's some more complicated stuff going on under the hood regarding what it means for something to be baked into theism, but that's the basic gist. I barely need to do anything to show that theism predicts a necessary being, so I used it as my illustration. The Kalam is different though. The fact that the universe began to exist and has a cause is not just baked into theism the way a necessary being is. One might ask, for example, can God create an eternal, beginningless, infinitely old universe? If so, then what's the probability that God would create a finitely old universe that began to exist rather than an infinitely old universe that did not begin to exist. You need to give arguments that the probability that God would create a finitely old universe is higher given theism than the probability of a finitely old universe given naturalism. If I had kept talking about the Kalam throughout the entire video, instead of switching to the contingency argument, you can be sure that you would have seen those arguments. Actually, I do in fact give such arguments in my deceptively titled video on the Kalam, so you can check that out if you want.
In explaining why, I'll focus on the contingency argument. Most arguments for God's existence can be boiled down to, hey, this feature of reality is predicted by theism, and it's not predicted as well by alternative theories.
Okay, here's where I'd get into the problem that I have with astrology. Because astrology is really good at predicting certain things about people. Except that those things are so vague that of course it's going to predict things about people. However, that is not evidence for astrology. For it to be evidence for astrology, you need to show that those predictions are meaningful.
Okay, firstly, I want to make sure that we mean the same thing by prediction. When I say that proposition T predicts proposition E, I mean that the probability of E is high given T, or conditionalized on T. I don't just mean something said about the future. With that out of the way, I want to offer an account of when a prediction is meaningful, so that I can show that yes, cosmological arguments do in fact make meaningful predictions in their stage 1. Well, for a proposition to meaningfully predict some event, the event in question has to be intrinsically improbable. As an example, let's say I claim to know the future, and I start making predictions. If I correctly predict that the sun will rise tomorrow, that's not a meaningful prediction, because before I made the prediction, the probability of the sun rising tomorrow is already virtually 100%. But if I correctly predict that the winning lottery numbers tomorrow are, I don't know, say 7, 31, 82, 4, and 78, that's a meaningful prediction, because the probability that those specific numbers would be chosen in the lottery is really small. This also explains why the vague predictions of astrology aren't meaningful. If an astrologist predicts, say, that there's change in your future, there are so many ways for that to turn out to be true that it's actually quite an intrinsically probable proposition. It can be fulfilled if there's changes in your work, in your relationships, in your diet, and so on. The probability of change in your future is pretty much 100%. So, it's not a meaningful prediction if it does turn out to be true.
It's easy to make a statement like, what goes up must come down. That is a prediction that, in the majority of cases at least, is true, but is not as predictive as something like general relativity.
This is a really good example. There are so many imaginable paths that planets could take through the solar system that any particular path would be improbable. But general relativity managed to predict the precise paths of the planets through our solar system. So it predicted something intrinsically improbable, and this was a meaningful prediction.
Yes, theism predicts that the universe had to have had a beginning, and that beginning was caused by something, and in theism's case, that is God. But how meaningful is that prediction? It is very easy to predict that the universe, or at least the universe as we know it, had a beginning. Many religions have predicted that, and each religion that has predicted that predicts that in a different way. So that kind of stuff does undermine trying to use it as an argument for theism.
I think precisely the opposite is true. If tons of people with theism-like worldviews all thought the universe had a beginning, all this shows is that there's broad consensus that the probability of a finitely old universe is high given theism. That's something that the theist needs to establish to get the Kalam to work. But this still leaves us with the question, is theism's prediction of a universe that began to exist a meaningful prediction? Well, given the account of meaningfulness I outlined earlier, we need to ask, is the beginning of the universe intrinsically improbable? Well, here's one argument to that effect. Every moment of time that anyone has ever observed in their lives was always preceded by another moment. For every day that any human has ever lived, there was always a yesterday. But what theism predicts is that there was one moment that was unlike all the other moments, the first moment. There were no moments before it. So everyone who says the universe began to exist is making a very weird claim, an intrinsically improbable claim. So if you can run a successful stage 1 argument of the Kalam, you've shown that theism has made a meaningful prediction. Likewise, for the contingency argument, no object in any everyday human experience is self-existent, so it's meaningful that theism correctly predicts such a being. One final note, I'm kind of confused why other religions were brought up when the topic before us is bare theism. Anyways, moving on.
Now, theism posits that there's a god who is, amongst other things, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and exists necessarily. So, strictly speaking, theism predicts that there's a necessary being, because if theism were true, the probability that there's a necessary being would be 100%. Now, the contingency argument establishes in the first stage that there's a necessary being. So, before you've even started getting into arguments that this necessary being is omnipotent or has a mind or whatever, you've already shown that theism has made a correct prediction. There is a necessary being.
Well, yes, that is a correct prediction, but I can also state that the universe has just always existed, just in a different state. That also predicts a necessary being, that being the previous state of the universe, and also doesn't have all the other fluff that comes with theism. You do not need to assume that the being has some kind of consciousness and that consciousness knows everything.
So this part was hard for me to understand until I realized that Planar was using the term necessary being to mean the cause of our local universe. So what Planar is proposing here is that the universe is infinitely old, and we could say that the entirety of the universe up to the creation of our local universe, that itself is the cause of our local universe. So what caused our local universe? It's just more universe. Now, this is a fairly standard objection to the stage 1 of the Kalam. If you want to see how I avoid that problem, you can, once again, check out my video on the Kalam.
It doesn't matter that a necessary being is logically consistent with other worldviews. As long as the probability of a necessary being, given these alternatives to theism, is less than 100%, the probability of theism will go up.
That is not how it works at all. The probability of theism being true remains the same regardless of whether any other worldview predicts a necessary being.
This is incorrect. Say there are 3 murder suspects, Adam, Bob, and Charlie. Based on the evidence, they are all equally likely suspects, so the probability that, say, Adam is the murderer is 1 in 3. But then we get some evidence that proves Charlie is not the murderer. Well, now the probability that Adam is the murderer has gone up to 1 in 2, because now there are only 2 equally likely suspects. Showing that Charlie wasn't the murderer raised the probability that Adam was the murderer. Similarly, if we get some evidence that doesn't completely prove that Charlie's innocent, it just lowers the probability that Charlie is the murderer to, say, 10%, this will still directly increase the probability that Adam is the murderer, from 33% to 45%. Bringing this back to theism, if we could disprove alternatives to theism, or even just make the alternatives less probable, this will still increase the probability of theism. And the probabilities of alternatives to theism do decrease when we learn that a necessary being exists, because these alternatives didn't predict the existence of a necessary being as strongly as theism did.
To use an example that I think most people are familiar with, let's say that I have a 6-sided die, and I roll it, and it comes up as a 6. What is the probability that the next roll will be a 6? Well, of course, it is 1 in 6. Let's say that I roll that die again and it does come up as 6. What is the probability that the next roll will be a 6? That also is 1 in 6. No matter how many times I roll a 6, the probability that the next roll will be a 6 is 1 in 6. Although, if I do roll enough 6s, it might start to look like the die is loaded. The probability of rolling a 6 is independent of any other roll of the die. Likewise, the probability of theism being true is independent of what other worldviews predict.
It seems to me that Planar has made a mistake with his analogy here. Planar asks us to consider an event, the roll of a dice, and a hypothesis, that the outcome of this roll is a 6. Then he asks us to consider a second event, a second roll of that dice, and a second hypothesis, that this second roll lands on a 6. Then he notes that because the events are independent, and the theories are independent, the probability of one doesn't affect the probability of the other. This is all true. But this has no bearing whatsoever on the case of theism versus other worldviews in the context of a necessary being. In Planar's case, we had 2 hypotheses that were being updated on the basis of totally independent events. But in the case of theism versus alternative worldviews, I'm asking you to update both of these worldviews on the same event, so to speak, that there is a necessary being. A more apt analogy is this. I have a six-sided die and I roll it. I have two hypotheses about the single event. The dice will land on 6 on its first roll, and the dice will land on 5 or less on its first roll. Then I get some evidence that the second hypothesis is incorrect. Obviously, that's going to raise the probability of the first hypothesis. So Planar's reasoning here is completely disanalogous.
And yes, I know that I just described the gambler's fallacy. I just prefer to explain my reasoning rather than just say, oh, this is a fallacy.
Okay, I am a huge fan of this. I really think that simply labeling things as a fallacy and moving on is unhelpful. If you think someone's reasoning went wrong somewhere, explain how you think it went wrong. I'm very happy that Planar intentionally chose to do that here.
Now, the more specific the prediction that your theory correctly makes, the more this verified prediction will raise the probability of your theory.
Okay, that part is true. If you make a prediction, the more specifics that you have in that prediction that turn out to be true, the more likely your hypothesis is to be true.
And the probability of a necessary being with unlimited power is also 100% given theism. So, a given cosmological argument will be made stronger if it includes a second stage that establishes that this necessary being does indeed possess unlimited power.
Yes, but you need to make an argument as to why the necessary being for the universe has unlimited power. That is the argument that I have yet to hear.
Again, I was just explaining what a stage 2 does in the context of cosmological arguments. I was not actually trying to defend a stage 2 case in that video.
It will get even stronger if you establish that this necessary being has a mind, and so on. All that is great, but again, it's technically all optional. You just need the first stage.
The problem is, though, is that the first stage is so vague as to render it completely useless as an argument for theism.
As long as the prediction is meaningful, like I argued it is, then it boosts theism's probability a lot and is therefore not too vague.
In fact, I would say that the more specifics that you add that you cannot show, for example, the necessary being having a mind, the more damaging that is to your argument. Why is this? Well, it's because of Occam's razor. You're adding more and more assumptions that you cannot show to be true.
Yes, the simpler your theory is, the better it is. I can totally get behind this. On my channel, I've argued that you can get all the cool stuff from theism, like a mind, omnipotence, and so on, from one assumption, so to speak. We posit that there's a perfect being. So, I think theism is an incredibly simple theory.
And on top of that, the prediction in the first place is so vague that anybody can make that prediction.
I already addressed this point earlier when we discussed how other religions predict the beginning of the universe, so moving on.
So instead of thinking of a successful stage 2 like a binary works or doesn't work, you should instead see it as more of a continuum. The strength of the argument goes up incrementally as the sort of being your argument proves is brought more and more into line with theism. Instead of the gap problem, I think a better name that avoids presentation problems might be the stack problem. The idea is, every time the theist argues the necessary being has an additional godlike property, the probability of theism goes up. So if their stage 2 needs some work, it's because the stack of godlike properties that they've established isn't big enough, and they need to work on that. This doesn't misleadingly imply that the argument is worthless until the theist has done this additional work.
The problem is, though, is that I have not heard that additional work being done. Yes, people say that, oh, there needs to be a cause for the universe, but they have yet to do the work that says that that cause must be a god.
Well, my original point still stands. If someone is arguing for the existence of God cumulatively, with each argument they present incrementally raising theism's probability, they might still include the bare stage 1 versions of the Coulomb contingency arguments, even if these arguments aren't very strong individually due to the fact that they can't get a working stage 2 going. Setting that aside though, Planar says he hasn't heard the work being done on stage 2 cases for theism. Well, one good resource that bridges the gap between a necessary being and God is How Reason Can Lead to God by Josh Rasmussen, also known as God to Lead Can Reason How.
If you can establish that this cause has to have properties like a mind, then yes, it strengthens your argument. But just saying that this cause has to have properties like a mind without first establishing it, that actually hurts your argument. The less assumptions that you have to make, the higher the probability that you are correct.
I briefly addressed simplicity considerations already, but yes, don't just randomly say things without substantiating them.
Anyway, that's it for this video. I was hoping to hear some arguments as to why the cause, or necessary being as he puts it, must have a mind or must be a god. Unfortunately, that was not presented. I get that that's not the point of the video, but it's still a bit disappointing.
Again, if you want to check it out, I actually do have a video defending my preferred version of the Kalam. On top of that, I have lots of other videos with cool and interesting arguments for God's existence.
But anyway, leave a like and subscribe if you like this video. Leave a comment letting me know what you'd like to see me make videos on in the future. I will see you in the next video. Between you and me, thank you for watching.
Ditto on all that, except, for me instead of him. Anyways, thanks once again to Planar Walk for making his response video. But that's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.